flight attendant stomped on the black CEO's documents. They were the FAA suspension papers with his name already on them. He stomped on the black CEO's documents, thinking destruction would intimidate. He didn't know the papers already contained the FAA suspension notice with his own name on it. Subscribe if you believe arrogance always trips over its own mistakes. The overhead bins were still snapping shut when the incident began, quietly, almost invisibly. In row 2A, Dorian Venn, CEO of Arison Systems, rested one hand on the leather armrest and the other on his briefcase. He didn't look like a man carrying documents that could cripple an entire airline. No suit, no bag. No signal to the world that he was on a mission far larger than himself. Yet inside that briefcase, sealed under a triple-fold lock, sat FAA-verified suspension papers for one flight attendant, Corvin Redall, a man whose name had turned up in multiple red flag reports, a man Dorian had personally helped investigate, a man now walking straight toward him. Corvin's steps didn't match the casual rhythm of a standard cabin check. Each tap of his heel sounded tighter, more forced. His eyes scanned the aisle like searchlights, but when he reached Dorian's row, they stopped cold. For a moment too long, he stood beside seat 2A, eyes flicking once, just once, toward the matte black briefcase at Dorian's feet. "Can I help you?" Dorian asked, voice neutral yet firm. The tone of someone used to being in control, but choosing not to assert it just yet. Corvin's lips parted, but no greeting came. Instead, a clipped nod. "Enjoy your flight," he muttered, though his eyes lingered like they were reading something that wasn't printed. Dorian returned the nod, then lowered his gaze to the briefcase. A chill passed through his spine. Not fear, but clarity. This wasn't coincidence. The very man he had come to report was working this flight, assigned to his section, and already acting like he suspected something. He opened the latches of the briefcase just a crack, confirming the papers were still inside. Top sheet visible. Suspension notice, Corvin Redall. Skirich Aviation Personnel Case #4791A. The ink hadn't even dried when the regulators stamped it. The plan was to deliver it in person, quietly. Not midair. Not like this. The intercom clicked on. "Flight crew, prepare for departure," said the captain, voice steady. Unaware of the brewing storm in row 2, the aircraft doors shut with a hydraulic sigh. The final seal of isolation. Dorian leaned back, breathing slowly. He hadn't flown as a passenger in months. Not since the reports started reaching his desk. Not since anonymous emails had hinted at a circle, a silent intergroup inside Skirich, dedicated to silencing dissent, intimidating whistleblowers, and burying safety violations under bureaucratic fog. Tonight, he was going to break that circle. Outside the window, the tarmac lights drifted away. The plane surged forward. Engines roared with a confidence that no longer felt reassuring. It was a familiar sound, but this time it came with an edge. Dorian scanned the cabin through the reflection in the glass. Passengers tucking in blankets, adjusting earbuds, sipping pre-flight waters. Blissfully unaware that a corporate battle was sitting right in front of them. Corvin passed through the aisle again, slower this time, less mechanical. His right hand brushed against the headrest of 2B, just adjacent to Dorian. The briefest of pauses, a twitch in his jaw. Then he moved on. Dorian closed the briefcase fully now, sliding it an inch further under the seat, heel resting lightly on top. He couldn't take chances. Not anymore. "You're just being cautious," he whispered to himself. Not paranoid, cautious. And yet the tension didn't ease. His thoughts returned to the report, 24 pages outlining policy violations, forged training certifications, a mishandled restraining incident that nearly escalated to physical harm. Every line had been reviewed by the internal ethics board, every signature validated, and all of it pointed to Corvin. Dorian adjusted his posture. He knew how this could go. If Corvin became aware of the documents before they were formally submitted, he might panic. Or worse, retaliate. But it wasn't just Corvin. Dorian's instincts told him the attendant wasn't working alone. During the investigation, several patterns emerged. Reports disappearing, witnesses suddenly recanting, strange overlaps in scheduling logs. Someone higher up had been pulling strings to keep Corvin active. Someone powerful, which made this flight, this night, a far riskier gamble than it first seemed. The cabin lights dimmed to a soft orange glow. Dorian opened a thin leather folder, reviewing the mission's final instructions one last time. Deliver the envelope directly to the Federal Aeroconduct Division office in Landmere. No digital copies. No third-party transfers. This was the last leg of a chain that had taken months to build. A chain that, if broken, could bury everything for good. Another shadow moved down the aisle. Corvin again. He stopped near 2A. This time, no words. Just a long look, one that bypassed courtesy and went straight to confrontation. His gaze dropped briefly to Dorian's feet, then to the briefcase, then back to Dorian. Dorian stared right back. Neither blinked. The engines settled into cruise mode. The hum returned. Then Corvin smiled, but it wasn't a warm one. It was the kind of smile that didn't reach the eyes. Dorian leaned slightly to his left, tilting the briefcase just out of full view. He didn't need confirmation. He already knew. The target had recognized the delivery. The plane had taken off. There was no going back. He exhaled once, low and steady, then whispered to himself, less out of fear, more out of solemn readiness. Tonight is the night everything breaks. Corvin's shadow slid across the aisle floor like a blade. His stride was sharp, clipped, too purposeful for a man tasked with serving drinks and adjusting seatbacks. He stopped at row 2A, where Dorian Venn sat with the quiet poise of someone used to carrying responsibility that others never see. Corvin's smile was brittle. "Sir," he said, voice tight but overly cordial. "May I ask what documents you're carrying in that case?" Dorian turned his head slowly, a flicker of suspicion already tightening his gaze. The briefcase rested securely at his feet, unopened since boarding. It hadn't drawn attention until now. "Documents," Dorian replied, his tone mild but firm. "I'm not carrying anything the airline hasn't already cleared." Corvin's hand twitched at his side, and his lips stretched into a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "We've received a tip about restricted materials. I need you to open the case for a quick inspection." The word need hung heavy in the air. Dorian felt it like a warning flare, a challenge not spoken but implied. He leaned back slightly in his seat, unbothered outwardly but calculating internally. Corvin's stance was rigid. His fingers, curled at his sides, betrayed nervous energy, not the kind that came from duty, but from desperation. "With respect," Dorian said calmly, "you don't have the authority to search personal property without probable cause. My belongings were cleared at security. If there's a concern, I suggest you radio the cockpit and follow procedure." Corvin's smile vanished. His face tightened like a rope pulled too fast. "Sir, I'm asking again. Open the case." Passengers nearby began glancing over. Dorian noticed the older man in 2C turning slightly, brow furrowed. Across the aisle, a younger man with earbuds half in looked up, sensing something off. A whisper traveled from seat to seat like a breeze before a storm. Dorian's pulse remained steady, but he felt the shift. The atmosphere in the cabin was tilting. Corvin was trying to create an incident. He could see it now in the man's eyes. This wasn't about protocol. This was personal. "Is there a reason you're singling me out?" Dorian asked, voice still level but colder now. "Because you've walked past several passengers with laptops, bags, and jackets. Yet you're fixated on mine." Corvin's jaw clenched. "I've received a report about you, Mr. Venn," he said, leaning in, voice lowered. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Dorian gave no reaction to the name drop. He hadn't offered it during boarding. That meant Corvin had already known. He suppressed a flicker of alarm. The implications were clear. This confrontation wasn't coincidence. It was planned. "That report," Dorian said quietly, "is either falsified or irrelevant. You're not a federal officer. You're not security. Step back." But Corvin didn't step back. Instead, He turned halfway to the front and gestured toward another crew member standing near the galley. "I've got a non-compliant passenger in 2A, he said, loud enough for most of the cabin to hear. "Possible restricted items. Requesting witness confirmation." The second attendant, tall, stocky, and expressionless, took a step forward, hesitating just enough to show he wasn't fully briefed. Dorian's grip on the armrest tightened slightly. The last thing he wanted was escalation in a confined space. But this was becoming harder to avoid. Corvin pivoted again, facing Dorian with forced calm but eyes alight with something darker. His gaze dropped to the briefcase. Then, with a sudden motion, he crouched slightly, fingers reaching for the latch as if he had every right in the world to pry it open. Dorian's hand intercepted him mid-motion, firm and commanding, pressing Corvin's hand away with practiced control. No raised voice. No panique. Just steel beneath the silence. "I said no," Dorian stated, eyes locked. "This ends here." The cabin air seemed to freeze. Nearby passengers were fully engaged now. Phones lifted discreetly, eyebrows raised. Murmurs spread. Corvin's nostrils flared. His hand dropped, not in retreat, but in rage. Then it happened. He lifted his foot and brought it down, hard, onto the edge of the leather folder that had shifted slightly from the case during the brief struggle. The sound cracked through the cabin. A sharp stomp that drew gasps from across the aisle. The impact jolted through the floor, the insult of it unmistakable. Dorian stared at the crushed edge of the folder beneath Corvin's shoe. The black leather warped and dented under pressure. He didn't move, not yet. The paper inside, once flat and pristine, now folded in places it never should have been touched. But the line hadn't been crossed yet, until Corvin twisted his foot. The slow grind echoed like thunder, even though it made no sound. Dorian could see it in the horrified expressions around him. The humiliation wasn't loud. It was deliberate, cruel, calculated. Corvin looked down at him, smirking faintly, as if he'd just put an end to something important. And he had. But not in the way he thought. Inside that folder was his own name, signed and sealed on an official FAA suspension order. He had stomped his own judgment into the floor, and he didn't even know it. Dorian's voice came out soft, but edged with quiet finality. "You just made your final mistake." Corvin's boot came down hard. The folder, half exposed beneath Dorian's briefcase, flattened with a sickening crunch as paper crumpled under pressure. The sharp smack echoed through the narrow cabin like a thunderclap, silencing nearby conversations mid-sentence. A gasp rippled through the rows as heads turned toward the sound, eyes widening in alarm. Dorian's hand remained firm on the briefcase, but his eyes dropped slowly to the floor where Corvin's foot, deliberately planted and grinding, had just desecrated the very document that could end his career. Corvin twisted his heel once more, as though crushing a threat beneath him. His stance was aggressive, body slightly crouched, chest puffed. The act was intentional, calculated. He knew the folder mattered, even if he didn't yet understand why. Dorian's expression didn't change. Not immediately, but behind his still eyes, his mind moved like a current, assessing, recalibrating, bracing. Passengers in nearby rows stared in confusion and fear, uncertain whether to intervene or remain silent. One older man in row 3 reached subtly for his phone, tilting the lens toward the scene as he tapped the red record button. Dramatic irony began to unfold in real time, and only Dorian truly grasped the weight of what had just happened. The documents beneath Corvin's boot weren't just paperwork. They were the signed FAA suspension orders, already cleared for enforcement. And at the very top of that first page, now smeared with grit from the cabin carpet and the residue of shoe rubber, was Corvin's full name. "You're making a scene," Corvin said lowly, with a tight smirk curling at the edge of his lips. He leaned in slightly, speaking so only Dorian could hear. "You think that briefcase makes you powerful? I decide what's a threat on my aircraft." He straightened and raised his voice. "Passenger in 2A is refusing a security compliance check. He may be hiding restricted materials." That line shot through the cabin like lightning. A woman in row 5 stiffened. A younger man 2 seats back leaned into the aisle to get a better look. Murmurs began, first confused, then fearful. Dorian's hand had not moved from the briefcase. He hadn't stood. He hadn't argued. And yet the accusation immediately shifted the atmosphere from curiosity to suspicion. Dorian slowly turned his gaze to the folder. Corvin's weight still pinned it down. A corner of the top page jutted out, curled and soiled, revealing part of a letterhead marked with Federal Seal watermarking. His breath remained steady, but tension coiled beneath his skin. This wasn't arrogance from Corvin. It was something else. A performance, perhaps, or a desperate attempt to assert dominance before something greater took it away. He slowly leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "You need to step back," he said. Eyes not on Corvin's face, but on his boot. Corvin didn't budge. "I said," Dorian repeated, his tone barely louder but sharper now. "You need to step back." Corvin leaned over again, voice cold. "Make me." That was the line Dorian had been waiting for, the moment Corvin crossed into reckless territory. With the same steady grace that marked his boardroom presentations and private negotiations, Dorian slid his hand off the briefcase and knelt. His fingers moved with quiet precision, slipping under Corvin's heel and retrieving the folder from beneath it. He didn't yank. He didn't rush. He simply extracted it with the certainty of someone who had every legal right to do so. The papers were bent, ink smudged where pressure and dirt had combined, but the letters of Corvin's name remained visible, blurred, but undeniable. Dorian unfolded the page, letting the sound of wrinkled paper speak for itself. "You shouldn't have done that," he said softly. Corvin scoffed. "What? Protected my cabin? You think you can walk in here with secrets and expect me not to act?" Dorian stood, holding the papers up for a second. He didn't show them to the crowd yet, but his voice cut through the rising tension with a quiet authority that silenced even the whispers. "These papers are no secret," he said. "They were going to be delivered professionally, quietly, through the right channels." He took a slow step forward, his tone never rising. "But you just made that impossible." Corvin took a step back, suddenly unsure. The passengers were no longer focused on the briefcase. They were watching Corvin now, studying his face, his voice, his reactions. Another passenger, young, sharp-eyed, maybe a college student, whispered, "I think he's recording this guy," nodding toward the man across the aisle. The shift was happening. Dorian looked down at the paper once more, reading the first line silently. Effective immediately. Suspension of duties. Authorization of internal inquiry. His eyes flicked up to meet Corvin's. "I don't think you realize what you just did." Corvin's facade faltered. "You have no authority here." Dorian's voice dropped to a razor's edge. "No." "But they do," he said, subtly tilting his head toward the gathering passengers and the phones they now held steadily like courtroom exhibits. He stepped closer, just enough to let Corvin see his own name stamped beneath the dirt. And then, the final line dropped like the silence before a storm. "You just stepped on your own suspension." Corvin lunged without warning. His arm cut through the air like a blade, fingers reaching with raw desperation toward the crumpled papers in Dorian's hand. But Dorian was already moving. He rose from his seat with a force sharpened not by panic, but by decades of disciplined leadership. His stance blocked the aisle completely, body squared and unshakable. The briefcase hung from his left hand, but the papers, creased, dirted, and damning, remained firm in his right. "You will not touch these again," Dorian said, voice calm but edged in steel. Passengers nearby recoiled. The cabin, once filled with the steady drone of engines and murmurs of idle conversation, now felt tense and hushed. Several phones rose above seatbacks, their red record icons blinking silently like warning lights. Corvin's face twisted with rage, his composure slipping. He shoved past a passenger from row 1B who cried out, stumbling sideways into his tray table. "He's tampering with flight security," Corvin shouted, pointing a trembling hand at Dorian. "He's interfering with classified cabin protocols." Dorian didn't flinch. "The only thing tampered with," he replied, slowly raising the wrinkled paper for all to see. "Was your own career." Gasps spread like a ripple through the narrow aisle. Several passengers leaned out now, eyes wide, recording from multiple angles. Dorian could feel the weight of their attention, and more importantly, their awakening understanding. Corvin's nostrils flared. He reached into his uniform pocket and pulled out something glinting under the cabin lights. Zip ties. The sight turned the atmosphere electric. "You're going to force a passenger into restraints?" Someone called out from behind. "For what?" "Holding paper." But Corvin ignored them. "I am authorized," he barked, stepping forward again. "This man is non-compliant. I have the right to subdue him under FAA regulation." "You knew," Dorian interrupted. His voice cut cleanly through the rising clamor. "You brought those zip ties because you were expecting this confrontation. You were waiting for it." Corvin hesitated, a beat too long. His eyes narrowed, but his hand trembled. Dorian took a half-step back and raised his voice, not to argue, but to declare. "These papers name you." Corvin read all. Every violation, every misconduct report. They were going to be delivered quietly. But you couldn't help yourself. A hush swept the rows. A man seated in row 3, tall, broad-shouldered, mid-30s, stood abruptly, stepping between Dorian and Corvin. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. His presence alone was enough to halt Corvin's advance. Corvin's mask cracked. Panic flared in his eyes, not just at Dorian's words, but at the realization that the narrative was slipping away. "Captain!" Corvin suddenly screamed toward the intercom. "Declare an internal threat. Now!" Dorian took another step back, retreating with deliberate precision toward the galley. The passengers parted for him as if guided by silent choreography. Corvin shouted again, but this time his voice was cracking, losing its command. "You just triggered a full protocol review," Dorian said, holding up the paper now stained with dust and crushed ink. Someone from row 2 muttered, "Wait, does that say his name?" Another voice from farther back, "That's his name. Look at it. It's printed right there." Corvin looked around the cabin, seeing not passengers but jurors, witnesses, cameras, evidence, and Dorian stood before them, calm and unyielding, speaking not to Corvin, but to the room itself. "This was supposed to be delivered quietly, but you forced it into the light." Corvin bolted down the aisle toward the cockpit, panic tightening his every move. "Get out of the way!" he shouted, waving his arms at confused passengers, trying to force a path forward. His tone had shifted from hostile to unstable. No longer a man enforcing policy, but a man unraveling in front of a crowd. The cabin buzzed with tension, phones still raised, fingers trembling as they recorded history in real time. In the center aisle, Dorian Venn remained motionless, one hand raised with the crushed suspension papers clearly visible. "You're not going anywhere," said Dorian quietly, his voice carrying more authority than volume. His eyes tracked Corvin's every movement, measured, precise, almost clinical. His mind calculated variables, passenger reactions, crew positioning, angles of exit, fallback strategies. But one thing remained clear: he would not let Corvin escape or destroy the truth. Corvin's next move was sloppy. He turned toward Dorian with a forced smirk, then spun back toward the cockpit, bluffing with speed. But the plan backfired. 2 male passengers, one in row 3 and another in row 5, rose from their seats at the exact moment and stepped into the aisle, blocking Corvin's escape without a word. The first, a middle-aged man in a gray polo, held his arms out calmly like a barrier. The second, younger and leaner, mirrored the stance like they'd rehearsed it. Corvin froze mid-step, caught between them like a trapped animal. "Let me through," he barked. "You've done enough," the man in the polo replied firmly. The commotion reached the cockpit. A chime rang out, followed by the unmistakable creak of the cockpit door opening. The captain stepped into view, his expression stern and composed. He was tall, perhaps in his 50s, with silvered temples and the upright posture of someone who knew how to manage chaos without raising his voice. His eyes scanned the scene, Corvin's sweat-soaked uniform, the passengers filming, Dorian standing calmly in the aisle. "I'm Captain Larrett. What's going on here?" he asked, not loudly, but with just enough gravity to pull the attention of the entire cabin. Dorian didn't move. He simply held up the crumpled documents in his hand and met the captain's eyes. "Suspension papers," he said, "filed by the Federal Aeroconduct Division, bearing this man's name. He just stomped on them." Corvin barked a bitter laugh. "That's a lie. He forged them." The captain walked down the aisle slowly, extending his hand. "May I see the papers?" Dorian passed them without hesitation. The captain examined the documents, flipping through the smeared pages, then pausing as his eyes fell on the upper right corner. An official watermark, barely visible beneath the dirt, but unmistakably authentic. "I've seen this formatting before," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "We're required to review this during our annual compliance briefings." Corvin's face paled. He took a half-step back, then caught himself and straightened his posture as if trying to reclaim his fading authority. "He's lying," Corvin insisted, pointing at Dorian. "I have higher clearance than you think. This is above your pay grade, Captain." A stunned silence gripped the cabin. The captain slowly turned toward Corvin, a deep frown forming. "You're telling me," he said carefully, "that as a flight attendant, you outrank the captain of this aircraft?" Corvin opened his mouth, then closed it. Foreshadowing thickened in the air like humidity before a storm. The captain gave a subtle nod toward the cockpit, where the first officer watched silently. Without needing a word, the first officer turned back inside and began typing a coded transmission to ground control. "Security escalation. Flight 609. Authorities requested on landing." Dorian saw it. So did Corvin. The moment cracked. No, wait," Corvin muttered. He turned to run again, but the two passengers remained unmoved. The man in the polo simply raised his hand. "You should sit down. I'll file a report," Corvin hissed. "You don't know what you're interfering with." The captain's voice cut through. "You're done. You're not leaving this cabin until ground authorities take custody. If you move again without instruction, you will be restrained." For a moment, Corvin trembled like a cornered wolf. His eyes darted across the cabin, searching for allies, for options. But the passengers had turned on him, not with rage, but with still, focused attention. Dozens of phones hovered like judgment. Dorian took a step closer, not threatening but measured. His voice lowered just enough to feel personal. "You're not afraid of losing your job," he said softly. "You're afraid of what the investigation will reveal." Corvin froze as the words struck like a hammer to the chest. His body, until now aggressive and rigid, faltered in place, eyes wide, breath catching in his throat. The cabin, once filled with murmurs and shifting feet, fell into an eerie quiet, broken only by the persistent hum of engines and the high-altitude hiss beyond the pressurized windows. Every passenger stared, caught in a moment that felt suddenly historical. Whatever Dorian Venn had just said, whatever truth he hinted at, wasn't ordinary. It was a blade slicing through the veil. Dorian remained steady, his feet square, his tone having shifted from defensive to investigative. He was no longer just protecting a file. He was drawing something darker out of the man across from him. "Step aside," the captain ordered from behind, voice firm but wary. "Mr. Redall, you are to be questioned now, and until further notice, relieved of active duty." Corvin didn't move. His chest rose and fell erratically. "You don't understand," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "There are classified circumstances. You have no idea what you're stepping into." Dorian took a breath, heart steady, calculating everything: tone, posture, camera angles. He had learned long ago that public justice didn't begin in courtrooms. It began with composure when others cracked. "The only classified material on this aircraft," he said calmly, "is the document you crushed with your own foot, and it names you." The murmurs began again, low and unsettled. The tension in the cabin thickened like storm clouds rolling in. Somewhere near the back, a man whispered, What is happening? While another filmed silently, adjusting for a better view. Then came the foreshadowing, a phrase that changed the air. I had orders, Corvin hissed through clenched teeth. Orders from above. That line struck Dorian like a spike of ice. It wasn't just deflection. It sounded like a man caught in a web too large to see its edges. Corvin's hands twitched, eyes darting, not toward Dorian anymore, but toward the intercom panel near the galley. He turned sharply and moved fast. Dorian reacted quicker. As Corvin lunged toward the panel, reaching for the intercom, Dorian stepped into his path, not with force, but precision. His hand rose gently, blocking the panel, his voice raised just enough to cut through the noise without shouting. Any announcement now must be recorded. It must be witnessed. He didn't need to say more. The captain gave a slight nod. A ripple passed through the cabin. Phones lifted again like a synchronized wave. The cabin became a courtroom, each passenger a jury member, each lens a permanent witness. Corvin looked at the phones. Panic replaced rage. His lips trembled. He turned again, this time away, toward the rear galley. He began to run. Dorian moved like a man who had rehearsed this in his mind 100 times. He didn't chase. He didn't yell. Instead, with a smooth step forward, he bent and yanked the aisle seatbelt across the passage, tight, angled, taut. It wasn't meant to restrain, just to slow. Corvin hit it at full speed. His shin collided, his balance snapped. He tumbled hard, slamming into the carpet with a grunt that echoed through the cabin. Passengers recoiled, but no one moved to help. They all watched. As Corvin sprawled on the floor, the crumpled suspension papers slipped from his pocket, scattering like fallen truths. One sheet slid beneath the seat. Another fluttered near a passenger's foot. But Dorian stepped forward, kneeling, gathering each one with deliberate care. His fingers moved not with haste, but with reverence, as if lifting pieces of something sacred that had survived a fire. Corvin groaned behind him, half-turned, dazed and humiliated. Dorian didn't look at him. He stood slowly, holding the dirt-smeared documents in his hand like a banner raised in silent defiance. Then, with the entire cabin hanging on his voice, he spoke. His tone was low, unflinching. His words became scripture. The truth you tried to bury is about to uncover everything you fear. Corvin lunged without warning. His body crashed into the aisle like a coiled spring snapping, arms outstretched toward Dorian Venn, and the crushed papers still clenched in the CEO's left hand. Dorian sidestepped swiftly, decades of high-stakes boardroom instinct guiding his reaction more than reflex. Corvin's momentum carried him past, slamming shoulder first into an armrest with a hollow thud that made nearby passengers flinch. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was electric. Enough! The captain barked from the front of the aircraft, his voice taut with command. Corvin read all. You are ordered to sit down immediately. This is a temporary detainment for safety protocol. But Corvin didn't move toward the seat. He stayed hunched beside row 1, breathing hard, sweat beading on his temple. His pupils were dilated, his lips slightly parted. He glanced around the cabin not like a man defying orders, but like a hunted animal mapping the exits. Passengers watched, some with phones raised, others frozen by the unease leaking into the air like slow gas. Dorian stood still, shoulders squared, briefcase pressed to his side, papers, dirt-stained but legible, still in hand. His eyes never left Corvin, not in fear, but calculation. He saw the twitch in Corvin's hand as it gripped the back of a headrest, the tension in his jaw like a man suppressing a scream. Something was wrong. This wasn't just a breakdown. This was fear, raw, deep, unspoken. I said sit down, the captain repeated. Corvin finally turned. If I sit, I won't make it to questioning. His voice was low, almost drowned out by the hum of the engines. The sentence shattered the room. The captain blinked. What does that mean? I can't. Corvin's gaze flicked to Dorian, then to the cockpit, then back again. You don't understand. I had to do it. I had no choice. Dorian felt a chill crawl up the back of his neck. His objective had evolved. No longer was it just about exposing misconduct or surviving a mid-air confrontation. It was about uncovering the source of this man's terror. "What did they threaten you with?" Dorian asked, voice calm, controlled. Corvin's mouth opened, then closed. His shoulders sagged, but his fingers still trembled. "You don't know what they'll do when they see my name," he whispered, voice just loud enough to carry to the first few rows. "Who is they?" the captain asked, eyes narrowing. But Corvin didn't respond. Instead, he stepped back a few inches toward the galley, eyes darting between the cabin door and the rear lavatories. His every movement was jittery now, as if restraining himself from bolting. Dorian took one step forward. "If someone's controlling you, say it. Now, before it's too late." Corvin stared at him with a mix of awe and dread. "You really weren't supposed to be on this flight," he muttered. The tension ruptured when Corvin suddenly twisted and tried to run toward the rear again. But two men in row 4, both middle-aged, both steady on their feet, stood and moved in unison, flanking Corvin with the instinct of men who'd served or seen danger before. They didn't tackle him. They didn't strike. One of them calmly extended his arm and grabbed Corvin's upper bicep while the other stepped in front, forcing Corvin to stop. "Easy," one of the men said. "Just sit. Let the authorities sort this out." "I can't," Corvin hissed. "You don't get it. He'll know. He sees everything." The captain strode forward, the first officer behind him holding a communication device. "We've been ordered to restrain him until we land. Federal responders are already waiting." As Corvin struggled, the captain nodded to the two men, who quickly used the same zip ties Corvin had earlier pulled from his pocket. Only now, they were his own shackles. His wrists were bound in front of him, and the men guided him to the forward jump seat. Corvin thrashed once, but it wasn't violence, it was fear, deep and paralyzing. "Dorian," he said through clenched teeth as he sat, "you don't know what you've done. You don't know what they'll do when they see my name." He laughed, confident in his dominance, unaware that every shred he crushed was evidence of the very authority that would soon end his career. If you believe abuse under a uniform always meets its reversal, hit subscribe now, because justice never misses a signature. Corvin thrashed once against the restraints, his breath ragged, the plastic zip ties cutting into his wrists as he twisted in place. The front of the cabin buzzed with tension, but no one moved. Every phone remained raised, cameras steady. Dorian Venn sat calmly just a few feet away, across from the jump seat where Corvin had been secured. In his hands, the crushed suspension papers, creased, dirted, and wrinkled by Corvin's earlier stomp, were slowly being flattened on his lap with meticulous care. His fingertips ran along the smudged ink as if reclaiming authority with each pass. The overhead lights flickered slightly as turbulence brushed the aircraft's frame, but Dorian remained focused. The captain crouched beside him, resting a hand on the armrest. "Are those still legible?" he asked, voice low. "Barely," Dorian replied, "but enough to matter." A long pause passed between them. Then the captain leaned in further. "I need to know the full scope. Who exactly are we dealing with?" Dorian inhaled, his jaw tightening. "This isn't just about one crew member snapping under pressure," he said. "For the past 8 months, I've been compiling reports from whistleblowers inside Skirich. The misconduct pattern was too consistent. Forged training records, intimidation protocols, false restraint procedures. Corvin was one of the key names that kept resurfacing." The captain blinked, his brows drawing together. "I filed a complaint about him myself," he muttered, 3 months ago. But nothing ever came of it. Dorian turned his gaze to him, unsurprised. It probably never left the building. A hush fell over the area again, broken only by the soft whir of the cabin pressurization system and the muted murmurs of worried passengers farther back. From his seat, Corvin jerked upright suddenly, eyes wide, nostrils flaring. He had heard every word. "You weren't supposed to be on this flight," he spat, struggling against his restraints. The captain instinctively stepped between him and Dorian, but Dorian raised a steady hand. He leaned forward, voice steady and firm. "Who warned you?" Corvin's chest heaved. "I didn't. No one said names but you. I got a message. A direct one. Someone said if you board tonight, everything comes crashing down. You weren't supposed to get this far." Dorian's brows drew together. The implication settled like a weight in the air. He turned to the captain. "I didn't file these papers yet because I suspected something higher up was protecting Corvin. But I didn't expect him to confront me. I thought, if anything, they'd bury the truth quietly." "Looks like someone changed the plan," the captain muttered. "And maybe it wasn't just someone," Dorian added. He pulled a small USB drive from his inside jacket pocket and handed it to the captain. "Encrypted witness statements. Copies of training falsifications. Corvin was just the face. But I always suspected he was under pressure." From the other side of the jump seat, Corvin groaned and slammed his shoulder into the wall. "You don't understand what you're walking into." "What am I walking into, Corvin?" Dorian asked without raising his voice. Corvin looked up, sweat streaking his temple. "You don't know who's really behind it. I tried to stop you because they told me what would happen if I didn't. You think this is about my job? I could have taken the suspension. But they—" His words trailed into a choked breath. "Who's they?" the captain demanded, but Corvin shook his head wildly. "I talk, they disappear my brother. My wife. You don't get it, this isn't about one airline. It's bigger." Dorian leaned back, his thoughts racing. The anonymous messages. The resistance at every bureaucratic checkpoint. The eerie timing of Corvin being assigned to his section. It wasn't coincidence. And then something shifted in the cabin. From the rear galley, a quiet figure stepped forward. Tall, clean-cut, dressed in standard uniform, he carried himself with rigid control. Dorian turned his head slightly. The man had been quiet the entire flight. The nameplate read, Brannick Vale. Their eyes met for the first time, and in that instant Dorian remembered the name. A faint mention in one of the earlier reports. A witness who had retracted a statement too quickly. He had dismissed it then, perhaps intentionally, but now Brannick's posture, his stillness, felt deliberate. Dorian's instincts flared. "Captain," he said softly. "Who assigned the crew tonight?" The captain looked puzzled. "Standard roster, I think." "Why?" "Because I may not have been the only one expected to be on this flight." As if sensing the scrutiny, Brannick turned and stepped back into the galley, disappearing behind the divider curtain. The lights dimmed slightly as the aircraft began its descent. Back in the front cabin, Corvin's shoulders sagged. He didn't look at Dorian anymore. Instead, he muttered just loud enough to be heard. "You think the papers scare me, but he scares all of us." The aircraft trembled slightly as it approached the runway, setting the stage for truths waiting below. If someone wanted me off this plane, Corvin might not be acting alone. The restraints dug into Corvin's wrists as he yanked against them, his breath rasping louder than the cabin's recycled air. The seatbelt harness pulled tight across his chest, but his legs kicked wildly beneath the jump seat as if sheer panic could snap the nylon straps loose. Two male passengers, one from row 3, the other from 4B, held the back of his seat firm, their hands clenched and braced, eyes wide but steady. It wasn't fear anymore that surrounded Corvin Reddell. It was the slow, suffocating realization that he was out of moves. "Stop pulling, man," one of the passengers muttered, voice low and tense. "You're just making it worse." Dorian Venn, seated 2 rows back, didn't flinch. He watched, not with judgment, but with that same unblinking calm that had carried him through the entire confrontation. The plane began its slow descent toward the tarmac, nose tilting forward with a subtle shift that rippled down the cabin like a silent announcement. This flight was ending, but the consequences were just beginning. The captain's voice crackled through the intercom, steady and official. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. Regulatory officers and federal marshals will be meeting us at the gate. Do not intervene. Do not block the aisle." Corvin's body jerked against the restraints once more, then slumped, chest heaving, sweat streaking down his temples. Dorian leaned slightly forward, narrowing his gaze. He had been waiting for this moment, this precise second when pressure cracked through the facade. Not out of vengeance, but because panic, more than anything, had a habit of speaking the truth. Corvin turned his head just enough to address the captain, his voice rasping low. "I didn't have a choice." The captain moved closer, kneeling beside him. "What do you mean?" They said if I didn't stop the guy with the documents." Corvin's throat bobbed. His eyes flicked to Dorian, then quickly away. "My family." The words didn't strike like an explosion. They sank like a weight. The truth wasn't arrogance. It was desperation. The stomp, the zip ties, the false accusations, everything Corvin had done was fueled not by ego, but fear. Dorian inhaled slowly, the realization settling in his chest. This wasn't just about misconduct. This was a cover-up big enough to endanger lives. "Who gave the order?" he asked, his voice measured. Corvin only shook his head, lips pressed tightly together, teeth trembling behind them. He didn't speak, couldn't. The fear was etched so deeply across his face. It was no longer just about consequences. It was survival. A flicker of motion caught Dorian's eye. Subtle. Too subtle. One of the other attendants, Brannick Vale, stood at the rear galley, arms crossed, expression unreadable. For hours, Brannick had barely moved, hadn't raised his voice once, hadn't interfered either way. And yet now, when truth finally surfaced, his eyes were watching everything, too intently. Dorian tilted his head slightly, studying Brannick. Something tickled the back of his memory. Early reports. There'd been a Vale mentioned once. Hadn't meant much then. But now the detail throbbed like a warning bell. Brannick's arms uncrossed the moment their eyes met. He shifted uneasily, adjusting a tray cart that didn't need adjusting. A flick of the wrist, a glance toward the jump seat. Too calculated to be casual. Corvin shifted again, eyes darting. Don't ask me to say it," he muttered, almost pleading. "He's watching." Dorian followed the gaze, straight to Brannick. Foreshadowing locked into place like the final tumbler of a vault. This wasn't spontaneous. It wasn't a meltdown. It was a mission, and Dorian had almost missed it. "Vale," Dorian whispered under his breath. The landing gear thudded down with a mechanical groan, prompting a wave of held breath across the cabin. The floor vibrated with tension. Corvin slumped deeper in the seat, his muscles giving out. His whisper came barely above a breath, but every syllable dropped like lead. "You think the papers scare me, but he scares all of us." The aircraft trembled slightly as it approached the runway, setting the stage for truths waiting below. When those doors open, the real storm begins. The aircraft doors burst open with a hiss of pressurized air, and within seconds, a unit of aviation marshals swept into the cabin like a silent storm. Their presence was firm but composed, blue uniforms crisp, eyes alert, each one knowing they were stepping into the aftermath of something extraordinary. Behind them came 3 agents from the Federal Aeroconduct Division, clipboards and bodycams ready, already scanning the aisle for the central figure. Passengers remained frozen in their seats, some clutching phones still recording, others whispering to one another with disbelief. At the center of it all, Dorian Venn rose slowly from his position, the wrinkled suspension papers still clutched in his hand. His breathing was even, his mind razor-focused. Every move now had to serve a single objective: ensure that the truth, crumpled, trampled, but still alive, made it into the hands of those who could act on it. "Mr. Venn?" asked one of the lead marshals, voice steady but respectful. Dorian nodded. "Right here." He stepped forward, holding out the documents. Just then, Corvin Redall was escorted from his jump seat. His wrists were still zip-tied, his face pale, the bravado long since drained from his body. As one of the regulators approached him, speaking calmly and asking, "Were you coerced into this behavior by anyone else?" Corvin's eyes, wild and twitching, didn't respond with words. Instead, he turned his head ever so slightly toward the rear galley. There, standing perfectly still, was Brannick Vale. It was a moment so quiet it seemed as though the cabin had stopped breathing. Dorian's gaze followed Corvin's, landing on Brannick's face with sudden clarity. The quiet, unremarkable flight attendant had been unusually observant the entire flight, too observant. Brannick didn't flinch, but his jaw tightened. Dorian raised a single hand and pointed. Him. Brannick's eyes darted toward the rear exit. He took one step backward. But an aviation marshal, reading the silent signal, moved swiftly to block his path. No, I'm just... Brannick started voice cracking, but the mistake came not in his words, but in his panic. In a frantic burst, he reached for the nearest drink cart and rammed it into the cabin wall with a loud metallic bang. The action stunned the marshals for a split second, just long enough for him to lunge at the papers in Dorian's hand. He never reached them. 2 marshals tackled him to the floor. The cart rolled sideways, clattering against the lavatory door. Dorian stood still, arm raised, the papers intact. Passengers gasped again, this time louder, some standing in their rows to see. The lead regulator stepped forward, his face darkening. That cart stunt was no accident, Dorian said coolly. You'll want to check the staff log. Brannick Vale's name appears on multiple documents tied to training irregularities and suppressed incident reports. Reports that disappeared. Brannick didn't respond. His face was pressed against the floor, one marshal holding his shoulder down while the other zip-tied his wrists behind his back. A second regulator joined the first, accepting the papers from Dorian with careful hands. He opened the crumpled stack gently, smoothing them flat across a folder for easier reading. The name at the top was now visible to all standing near. Corvin read all, immediate suspension pending investigation. But then came the final twist. Beneath Corvin's name, in the official addendum line typed in smaller, formal font, sat another. Brannick Vale, scheduled for secondary review and pending disciplinary hearing. The passengers nearest the aisle gasped aloud. One even whispered, "He knew." Dorian offered no prideful smirk, no gloating expression, just quiet resolve. "I didn't come on this flight to start a scene," he said, eyes fixed on the marshals now lifting Brannick from the floor. "But when the scene found me, I made sure the truth was ready." Corvin, now seated on the jet bridge in custody, watched it unfold from a distance. His expression shifted from shame to stunned relief, as if the weight pressing on him for months had finally named its true source. For a moment, he locked eyes with Dorian. There was no need for words. As the regulators backed away with the evidence secured, passengers began murmuring, not in fear now, but in admiration. A quiet man in 2A had come aboard with nothing but a briefcase and composure. He now stood at the center of what would become a federal turning point. The lead regulator, still holding the documents, looked back once more before stepping off. Dorian's voice carried clearly across the aisle. Justice was written before the flight ever left the ground. The terminal buzzed with hushed voices and the sound of wheels clacking across polished tiles. But around gate C-14, it felt like a courtroom had taken form without warning. Uniformed federal regulators from the Aeroconduct Division moved with intent, positioning themselves between groups of disoriented passengers and visibly shaken crew. Dorian Venn stood near the center of it all, calm, composed, and deliberate. His clothes were wrinkled from the flight, the suspension papers in his hand still crumpled and faintly stained with the shoe print of Corvin Redall. But his voice cut clean through the chaos. "I was seated in 2A, Dorian said, addressing the lead investigator. "Timeline begins at roughly 30 minutes after cruising altitude. You'll want to start reviewing footage from that point forward." A young officer took notes rapidly, but what struck everyone nearby wasn't the content. It was the control. Dorian's tone never wavered. For every question asked, he had a timestamp, a description, a reference point. His memory was surgical, his language meticulous. Other passengers leaned in, some to offer supporting footage from their phones, others to simply watch a man unravel the truth without flinching. Tension hung thick in the air. One of the investigators raised a brow. "You're speaking like someone who's done this before." "I have," Dorian replied, "not as a boast but as a signal. My role at Arison Systems includes regulatory oversight and ethics compliance for all partner carriers." The officer looked up, eyebrows knitting. That changed things. But before momentum could carry forward, a new figure entered the scene. A senior representative from Skirich Airlines, dressed in a perfectly pressed navy blazer, flanked by two assistants holding tablets. His smile was rehearsed, and his words even more so. We'd like to assure everyone that this situation, while unfortunate, does not reflect the values of Skirich, he began. We are initiating a full review and— Stop, Dorian said flatly, interrupting him mid-sentence. His voice, though quiet, commanded silence. This isn't about values. It's about protocols. And what your airline has been hiding behind them. The man hesitated, glancing nervously at the regulators. I'm requesting an immediate audit, Dorian continued, holding up the crumpled document. Your crew training and disciplinary records. Start with this man, Corvin Redall. Then follow the chain upward. The lead investigator gave a slight nod. Request accepted. A visible ripple passed through the terminal. Reporters were beginning to arrive outside the secured area. Cell phones were still recording. What had started as a mid-air altercation was evolving into something larger, something systemic. That's when Brannick Vale was escorted past them, wrists bound, flanked by two marshals. His jaw was clenched, his eyes downcast. But just as he passed Dorian, he mumbled something low, almost inaudible. This isn't the end, Brannick muttered, his voice coarse. There were others. They expected me to stop it before it left the plane. The officers tensed, but Dorian simply turned his head, meeting Brannick's gaze with cool certainty. He didn't blink. He didn't raise his voice. I know, he said. The words weren't a threat. They were a promise. Around them, the passengers who had once feared an onboard crisis were now witnesses to something far deeper. The slow dismantling of a protective wall built on lies. One by one, passengers approached the investigators. A man from row 3 offered time-stamped footage of Corvin trying to grab the briefcase. A young boy's father from row 4 showed the moment Dorian had held up the suspension document. Each video aligned with the others, building a mosaic of truth no statement could contradict. Mr. Venn, one investigator asked, were you aware Brannick Vale might be involved before today? I suspected, Dorian said, but I needed him to act on camera. The documents alone weren't enough. Public accountability was the only way to expose the full structure. And what structure is that? A covert internal circle inside your airline, Dorian replied, handing over a folded printout. The clearance circle. They've been suppressing reports for at least 2 years. Look at the timestamp gaps. Every complaint filed against certain crew members, gone without explanation. The officer unfolded the sheet, his face tightening as he scanned the data. Around them, murmurs spread, fear, awe, and disbelief woven into one collective breath. Then Corvin was brought through the same walkway. His wrists weren't bound now, but his steps were slow. As he passed Dorian, their eyes met again. The rage was gone. In its place was something quieter, recognition, maybe even regret. He said nothing, only paused briefly, and then continued walking. The Skirich representative, flustered and sweating, tried once more to take control. We will of course issue a formal apology to— No, the investigator interrupted this time. You'll issue a full disclosure. And starting now, your digital logs are being seized. The man stammered but said no more. A few feet away, a teenage passenger stared at Dorian like he was watching the end of a film. Mister, how did you stay so calm up there? Dorian turned, catching the boy's eye. His expression softened. Because panic serves chaos. But truth, Dorian said, voice low. Truth just waits for the right altitude. As officers moved to secure statements, the noise of the terminal returned, but it never touched the center of the scene, where Dorian stood like a calm eye in the storm, papers in hand, justice in motion. His role was no longer just about exposure. It was about prevention, rebuilding the system from within. As Brannick was led down the concourse and Corvin disappeared behind a corridor wall, Dorian turned back to the lead officer, pointing to the row of witnesses still waiting to testify. This plane carried more than passengers. It carried the truth they tried to bury. News broke like wildfire. Within hours of landing, grainy cell phone videos flooded public channels. Passengers' footage from Altair Jet Flight 609. Each clip showing the same moment from different angles. The instant Corvin Redall stomped down on the suspension papers bearing his own name. The sound of his heel grinding into the printed evidence echoed louder now through social feeds, becoming a symbol of irony that caught the nation's attention. But the public didn't just mock Corvin. They recognized the weight of what he had crushed. It was a document of truth, and in destroying it, he'd revealed something deeper than defiance. He'd revealed fear. At Skirich Airlines headquarters, the reaction was immediate. Crisis lights blinked across conference room panels. Executives scrambled, their phones lighting up with calls from regulators, press outlets, and federal oversight offices. By midday, multiple supervisors were quietly placed on emergency administrative leave, a sanitized phrase masking a scramble to preserve the company's crumbling image. But Dorian Venn, seated in a quiet, neutral-toned federal holding suite, had no interest in image control. His focus had shifted to the root system beneath the chaos. The clearance circle. Dorian leaned forward in his chair, sliding a worn leather folder across the polished table toward a federal officer named Rannick Vale, a tall man with sleeves rolled up and eyes heavy with exhaustion. Inside the folder were names, flight numbers, training irregularities, and personal testimonies from whistleblowers, all collected months before the flight. As Vale flipped through the pages, Dorian spoke with calm precision. "These aren't just coincidences," he said. "Each report was signed, filed, then deleted. Every case traces back to one central processor. Branik Vale. Vale Paused. You're saying this was intentional sabotage of the audit system?" "No," Dorian replied, his voice steady. "It was orchestration." At that exact moment, across the terminal's security division, another team of investigators reviewed boarding footage from Flight 609. One officer squinted, rewound a frame, then called over a colleague. The video showed Brannick Vale, silent, expressionless, standing near the gate an hour before departure, tampering with the crew manifest and quietly switching Dorian's seat assignment. The clipboard had been replaced minutes later. His movements were quick, intentional, almost rehearsed. Back in the holding room, the door creaked open. A younger officer stepped in, whispering something to Vale. He nodded grimly and turned back to Dorian. "We found it." He was setting up a staged disruption. Dorian nodded once, not in surprise, but in confirmation. "Had I been seated elsewhere, there may have been no witnesses. No footage. No suspension. Just another report buried in silence." Suddenly, a soft knock. Another officer entered, escorting Corvin Redall. No longer panicked, Corvin appeared subdued, pale, eyes downcast, wrists still bearing faint marks from the zip ties. He requested, through clenched nerves, to speak to Dorian alone. The room cleared, except for one guard by the door. Corvin sat. Silence lingered between them before he finally whispered, "I didn't mean to stomp it. I did. But not because of pride." Dorian's eyes stayed fixed on him, unmoved. "I was scared," Corvin admitted. "Brannick told me you were a plant. He said you were sent to bring the whole airline down. He said if I didn't stop you, my family would." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Dorian's voice was quiet, but carried the weight of principle. "You were afraid of losing something. I understand that. But fear doesn't erase responsibility. Rank doesn't erase truth." Corvin swallowed hard. "You could have exposed me a long time ago." "I didn't want to expose you," Dorian said. "I wanted to end the system that made you a weapon." As Corvin was led back out, the room remained still. Outside, the footage from Flight 609 continued its viral spread. Major news outlets picked up the story, using split screens of the stomped papers and Dorian calmly holding them up after the confrontation. Hashtags trended worldwide. Aviation watchdogs released statements. Policy boards scheduled emergency meetings. The final twist unraveled late that evening. Investigators confirmed that Brannick Vale had not only altered Dorian's seat assignment, but also submitted a falsified internal report framing Dorian as a disruptive passenger. The report was found half-completed, time-stamped minutes before boarding. Had the plan succeeded, Dorian would have been removed quietly, no witnesses, no suspension served, and the clearance circle would have survived another flight. But it hadn't gone that way. As Dorian exited the federal building, night air swept across his face like a quiet vindication. The lights of the city blinked in the distance, indifferent and constant. But tonight they bore witness to a truth finally revealed. The truth is no longer trapped at 38,000 feet. It's landing everywhere now. 3 months later, the sound of shoes against polished marble echoed through the tall corridors of the Federal Aviation Oversight Building in Capitol Crest. The room was full. Press badges hung from necks, cameras were poised, and government officials sat in rigid rows beneath towering banners that read, National Aero Conduct Reform Act, Press Briefing. At the center of it all, standing with composed authority behind the podium, was Dorian Venn. The same man who once sat in row 2A, briefcase at his side, documents crumpled under the heel of a flight attendant, now addressed the nation as the catalyst behind the most sweeping reform in commercial aviation oversight in decades. No time was wasted on ceremony. As the lead investigator stepped forward and adjusted the mic, his voice carried across the hall. This initiative exists because one man refused to let misconduct stay hidden at 38,000 feet. Dorian remained still, his stance confident but never performative. Behind his eyes was the memory of Corvin Redall's face twisted in panic, of Brannick Vale's eyes darting toward the galley, of passengers gripping their seats, filming truth into existence. That flight had not just revealed corruption, it had ignited a movement. The act being unveiled was no mere gesture. Its mandates were sweeping: federal placement of independent cabin monitors on high-risk routes, real-time misconduct tracking accessible to passengers, mandatory retention of disciplinary reports, and most notably, a transparency clause that would prevent any airline from burying complaints. Every policy echoed a moment from that flight. As the policy team outlined the protocol changes, Dorian's gaze swept the room. At the back, quiet but present, sat Corvin Redall. No handcuffs, no press attention, just a man who had walked a long road since that flight. His posture was calm. He looked different, less haunted. The shadows were still there, but he carried them like someone who had begun to reckon with their weight. Dorian didn't wave. He didn't need to. Corvin's nod was enough. Brannick Vale was nowhere to be seen. He was awaiting trial on multiple federal charges: obstruction, coercion, falsifying safety logs, and evidence tampering. It was ironic. Vale had tried to erase reports. Now, his own name was engraved on the system he tried to undermine. The investigators took turns praising Dorian for his poise, his clarity, and, most impressively, for predicting how far the rot reached. He didn't just report misconduct, one regulator said. He mapped it, traced it, and proved it. As passenger testimonies from Flight 609 were played, screens showing edited clips of the incident, each voice narrating their angle of what they saw, an emotional tension filled the room. It wasn't sensational. It was sobering. A reminder that the cabin had become a courtroom in the sky, and Dorian had been its lone advocate. The final speaker concluded, and the room stood in polite applause. Not for politics, for clarity, for justice. Afterward, as the crowd began to disperse, a young federal officer, early 20s, clearly new to the ranks, stepped nervously toward Dorian. His voice cracked slightly with respect as he asked, "Sir, how did you stay so calm? When everything was collapsing, how did you not panic?" Dorian didn't answer immediately. He turned slightly, eyes drifting to the side wall where the image of the suspension papers was displayed in crisp digital clarity. The memory was vivid. The sound of Corvin's shoe grinding the paper, the smirk on his face, the gasps of the passengers, the storm just beginning to swirl. He looked back at the young man and gave a quiet, steady smile. Sometimes, fate places the truth under pressure, so it can rise where everyone can see it. The officer nodded, visibly moved. As Dorian stepped outside into the bright morning light, the marble steps behind him casting long shadows, he allowed himself a breath. Not of relief, but of purpose. The work wasn't finished. But it had begun, and it had begun with that sound. That stomp. That moment of blindness that let the world finally see. The day he stomped those papers was the day he stepped into his own truth and forced the world to see mine. He destroyed the documents and froze when it was revealed they were the FAA suspension papers, sealed with his own accountability. If you believe true power turns betrayal into proof, subscribe now, because justice always lands where it matters most. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights prejudice, arrogance, and the irony that unfolds when authority meets accountability. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage conversations about equality, integrity, and respecting every individual regardless of status or background.